and welcome to our session about secondary classroom behavior management. So in today's session, we are going to talk a lot about what behavior is and what it means. But then we're also going to talk about how we can set up our secondary classrooms to meet the needs of those students who have behavior challenges. So we're going to talk about behavior through a proactive lens. Obviously, we're going to talk about some stuff that we can do if we see behaviors happening, but mostly we're going to be focusing on the proactive lens because that really is the biggest piece of classroom management. So, to begin, I want us to define what behavior is. So, we probably all have some kind of thought or idea about what behavior is and what behavior isn't. But it's really important for us to explicitly outline that so that you understand this is actually what behavior is. And this is actually behavior that I should be concerned about for my students. So, behavior is anything that a person does that can be observed, measured, or repeated. So, it's anything that we are physically seeing our students do or that they are taking part in. So, it's actually something that we could say, okay, well, I saw that happen. I can tell you how many times it happened or how long it happened. And I can tell you if it's happened more than once. So, it's something that if someone does it, then someone else could do it as well. So that is what a behavior is. What a behavior is not is some kind of personal motivation, internal processes, or feelings. So mad isn't a behavior. Sad isn't a behavior. Upset isn't a behavior. Happy isn't a behavior. So those are all feelings and those are things that we use to like quantify the way we feel quantify behavior sometimes, but that's not fundamentally what behavior is. So, behavior is actually what is happening whenever you feel those things. So, it's not that feelings and those personal motivations and internal processes are not part of it, but that isn't what the behavior actually is. So, if I say, well, this student is just always mad, that's not a behavior. Mad is not a behavior. What are they doing when they're mad? So, when they're mad, are they turning their desk over? Are they storming out of my classroom? Are they punching the wall? Are they pushing their friend? What is it that they are actually doing? So I want you to kind of think about behavior through that lens as we talk about some of this classroom management stuff and how we can avoid some of those reactive strategies and opt in for those proactive strategies. So like I said, we're going to talk a lot about what behavior looks like to begin this session and then go more into what we can actually do in our classrooms. So just like I said, behavior is something that we can actually see. It's not a description. So these are just kind of some examples of good and bad behavioral definitions. You may never write a behavioral definition, but it's still important for you to understand what a behavioral definition looks like. So if you do have a student in your class who is getting maybe like ABA services or some kind of behavioral services through the school, they are going to ask or show you behavioral definitions, and you're going to know exactly what you're looking for and exactly what that behavior is. But even if they don't ask you those things, it's going to be very important for you to be able to recognize, okay, this student is upset. What does it look like when student Z is upset? Then I can say, okay, these are the behaviors I'm looking for. This is the explicit stuff I'm looking for. So a good example for class disruption is during independent work time, the student gets up and walks away from his desk and begins talking to other students and taking items such as pencils or paper off of their desks and throwing it on the floor. Class disruption is not defined as the student asking a question in class to clarify misunderstandings, sharpening their pencil, or coughing and sneezing. So whenever we're talking about this, there is like what that actually looks like, but then we also include what it doesn't look like. We include that part about what it doesn't look like so that we know exactly what it is we're looking for. So somebody could come in off the street and I could say, hey, I need you to look for these behaviors. And they would know exactly what I was looking for. So they could collect data on that. And we'll talk about collecting data on behaviors in just a few minutes. But that's a big piece of making sure we're managing behaviors, making sure we're managing our classrooms, and making sure we're supporting our students. So a bad example of this definition would be when the student wants attention, he bugs other students to get a rise out of them. So, okay, well, we kind of know what he's doing there, but like, what is he doing to bother those other students? What does that actually mean? I need to know exactly what it is I'm looking for. So, some questions for you to ask whenever you're trying to determine whether or not a behavior is something that you need to intervene with, if it's something you can handle in your classroom, or if it's something that you need to include administration in or some other parties. Just some things to think about. So, what behaviors are potentially dangerous? So, is the behavior that they are exhibiting, is it something that they could harm themselves when they're doing it? Are they harming others? Could they potentially harm you? That's very important. So, if the behavior is dangerous, then obviously you probably need to get somebody outside of your classroom to help with that. So, that is probably the time to talk to an administrator to get some additional support. I also want you to think about how long they have been a problem. So how many, days, weeks, months, whatever, have you been seeing this behavior? Has this been how the student has behaved the entire time they're in your classroom, or is this something new? If it is a new behavior, there are lots of different reasons that that may be happening. So there may be something going on outside of school that we don't know. Maybe they're struggling in school. But typically, there's going to be some kind of cause for that behavior that is causing them to do whatever it is. So behavior is a form of communication, and sometimes it's hard to think of it as being such. But whenever we think of behavior, I want us to think of it as our students are trying to tell us something. So there are going to be times that maybe students have, become the sole provider in their family because neither of their parents, they've both lost their jobs or something like that. So this kid's having to work like double hours. They're coming to school tired. The last thing they want to do is sit in class and listen. So maybe they put their heads down on their desk. Maybe they fall asleep in class. Maybe, they're exhausted and have some kind of outburst at one of their friends because their friend says something that makes them mad. Um, we have to think about all these different things and why that behavior might be occurring. So, knowing how long it's been a problem can help us kind of figure out, okay, what has changed in this child's environment? Has anything changed and what could be going on? And that's going to help us figure out what we need to do to support that. Will changing this behavior provide more opportunities for learning, independence, inclusion, or socialization? So, if this behavior changes, is this going to improve their life? Is it going to improve your classroom? Is it going to improve their learning? If it doesn't improve any of those things, then it's probably not something we need to be super concerned about. So, there are some behaviors that we see and some things that go on in our classrooms that are just more of a, oh, that's something that bothers me as a person. That's something that gets on my nerves. It's like a pet peeve, that things maybe they're not actually affecting that student's access to the school, the access to the curriculum, or anyone else's access to those things in that setting. So we have to kind of think about what battles we're going to pick. Not saying that you should just let everything slide in your classroom, but sometimes we put too much energy on stuff that, like, at the end of the day, I don't know that it really matters. So we just have to think about, will changing those behaviors or correcting those behaviors or improving those classroom behaviors help any of these things? Which behaviors is the most disruptive to the class or other students? So sometimes you're going to have students that exhibit a lot of different behaviors. So you may just have to pick one to focus on. So if there's one issue that you're seeing in your classroom every single day, um, that's the one that you probably need to focus on. If you have 5 or 6 different issues going on in your class every day, you're going to have to pick the one that's the most disruptive to the class and to other students. So that's the one that you need to start with. Not saying that you forget all those others, but you need to start with the one that's the most disruptive or the most impactful. That's kind of really where you need to start. We can't go in and make all kinds of crazy changes all at once. So sometimes it's going to be a process. And we're going to talk about making sure our classrooms are built in a way that we're being proactive later on so that maybe you're not running into these issues. But even if you build a very proactive behavior classroom management based classroom, you're still probably going to run into things along the way. So students are different, needs are different, all kinds of stuff is going on outside of just that school or classroom setting. And we have to be aware of those things. So why do some behaviors occur? So this is another thing that it's really important for us to understand, like, why is behavior occurring? So we know it's a form of communication, but why are they trying to communicate some of these things? So to think about that, we think about the function of behavior. So behavioral functions can be put into 4 different categories. So they can be for escape, attention, access to some kind of tangible or something that you're wanting, and then like sensory or automatic. So we're going to break each of these down and talk a little bit more about those. So if you want to just have something to remember it, you can think about eats. That's kind of our little way to remember escape, attention, tangibles, and sensory. So all behaviors can fall into one of those categories. So escape, basically that is whenever someone engages in some type of behavior that gets them out of doing something they do not want to do. So this can be like an actual task. It could be around a specific person. It could be in a specific content area class. They're escaping something they do not want to be involved in. So usually this is something that is learned. So they have escaped this in the past. So typically kids are not going to just try to escape something for the sake of doing it. It's going to be because they have learned that if I do this, then I can get out of doing this. So if you think every time Joe is prompted to do a reading assignment, he asks the teacher if he can go to the bathroom. The teacher has always let him go to the bathroom in the past when he asked. So it's important to think about some of that stuff where, okay, what are we doing now and what kind of precedent are we setting for the future? So obviously, I'm not saying you shouldn't let students go to the bathroom, but every time you're asking them to do a task, if the same student asks to go to the bathroom, then they're escaping that task. So they are asking to go to the bathroom because they're trying to get out of doing whatever it is you want them to do. And the only reason that that works is because they're actually getting out of it. So if they are not getting out of it, if you are like, yeah, you have 5 minutes, but then when you come back, you're going to have to start on this, then that escape is not as great. So they're probably not going to do that in the future. But if you do not make them or hold them accountable for getting the work done or being back in class in a certain amount of time, then they will probably do that over and over and over again. So, we see students do all kinds of things to escape. The bathroom example is just one that we see most often. But if you have a student who every time you ask them to do something in class, they put their head down on their desk and go to sleep, or just are totally unresponsive to you, then they are escaping you because they have not been made to do that task in the past. Again, not saying that you need to be like, okay, well, you have to do this right now. You need to figure out what is keeping them from wanting to do the task, and have that conversation with them. That's the beauty of working with older students or students in middle and high school because we can have those conversations. And it's really, really important to have those conversations. Later on, we're going to talk about building relationships with our students and making sure that they know that we are creating a safe, supportive environment for them. But having those conversations is part of that. So instead of just overreacting and being like, why aren't you doing your work? You need to do your work. You never do your work. We need to be able to be like, hey, why don't we talk about this? Can you tell me why you're not doing your work? And maybe in that specific moment when they put their head down on the desk is not the time to have that conversation. But you might want to talk about that after class or before class the next day. You need to have that conversation. It may just not need to be in that moment, because you're probably going to be heated and that student is already going to have kind of shut down. So that may not be the best space to have that conversation in. So just making sure that you are handling things with a, reasonable tone, reasonable voice, reasonable expression, that can go a long way whenever we're talking about students escaping. So, students also sometimes will escape environments that they don't want to be in. So maybe they just really have a problem with somebody else that's in your classroom. Maybe you and that student don't get along very well. And that's okay. Like there are going to be times whenever your personality and a student's personality don't really go together. But we have to figure out how to work through those things. So we want to make our classrooms welcoming for all students, no matter whether it's a student that we really get along with really well or not. We want them to come into our classes and do the work. So we'll talk more about that later on and how we can do some of those things. So some different strategies that we can do whenever we're talking about students who are escaping. We can allow breaks, so they can request these breaks. I would put like a limit on it, so a certain amount of time. You have a certain amount of break cards for the, semester or for the, grading period or for the week or month or whatever. But it's good for students to be able to take breaks. We as adults want to take breaks. I mean, we have all probably sat in a session and thought, I just need to get up and go somewhere because my brain is overloaded. So that's just a natural thing that we should allow. So the thing about that is we can't just say, okay, well, you just take a break whenever you want to. We need to make sure students are requesting those things and we're not just, letting it happen whenever they want it to happen. So So if students don't know how to request breaks, then they're not going to. So maybe you have break cards, maybe you have like a punch card that they have, maybe they just ask you for a break. They just need to know how to do those things appropriately. So making sure that we teach students our expectations for requesting breaks is really, really, really important. Shortening work time, so maybe not expecting them to do, work for over half the class. Maybe they can do some group work. Maybe they have just some different opportunities to work in different situations and settings. So, making sure that those things are engaging to students, and we're going to talk about that more later too. Um, but making sure our classes are engaging. We're not just standing up there lecturing the whole time. We're not just expecting students to sit down and listen and work, which there have to be expectations. I understand that, but um, sometimes that's not conducive to the learning styles of all of our learners. And just again, even as adults, it's hard for us to sit still and fully participate for hours at a time. So just understanding our students' needs and understanding that they are human. Even though we've asked them to sit there and listen, they still have those needs and physical urges to get up and move around or just talk to somebody or take a break, or decompress for a moment. Using visual timers, that's another great option. So students know how much time they have to work, how much time you're expecting them to spend on something. And I'm going to show you some pictures of those in just a second. Student choice, so getting students involved, that's a great way to make your lessons more engaging and your content more engaging, giving students the opportunity to choose how they show what they know. Now, there are some times that we cannot give students choice on stuff because the standard outlines explicitly what they have to do to show us they have learned something. But on those times where it's a little bit more flexible, just giving them the opportunity to decide, okay, well, instead of writing this essay, I want to create a fake podcast or I want to create a YouTube video or something like that. Giving them choice, that gives them a little bit more autonomy. And it also just helps them focus in on the things that they really enjoy, which will make your class more enjoyable, which will in turn help them not want to escape it as much. So, just giving them that opportunity to be involved in their own learning is really, really important. And I mentioned student choice a couple of different times, but student choice is just very important in behavior management and classroom management in general. Everyone does better whenever they have choice and they can kind of guide their own learning and their own destiny. Using first then schedules. So first we're going to do this, then we're going to do this. So students know what's coming up. Making tasks in the class more engaging. That's a huge piece. And then providing reinforcement. So providing students with some kind of, hey, you did a good job on this. Thank you for doing that. Here's this, or hey, you did a good job on this. Like, you don't have to do the last five problem ones on the page. So providing some kind of incentive almost, that can also help students feel more engaged and keep them on task more. So, talking about some of the stuff on that previous slide. So, up in this left-hand corner, we have positive and negative reinforcement. So, reinforcement increases a behavior. So, if we're seeing that students are really engaged in their learning, really engaged with a task or something like that, we can provide reinforcement. So, that could be positive reinforcement where we give them something. Hey, I see you working. You're doing a really great job. So, we could just give them verbal praise. We could say, hey, I see that you're working, you're doing an awesome job. Why don't you get something to eat out of the, snack box or something like that? So we're giving them something for doing whatever it is that we're wanting them to do. Negative reinforcement still increases behavior, but it is negative because we take something away. So that's that example where I said, hey, I see that you're working really hard, because you've been working so hard. You don't have to complete the last five problems on the worksheet. So we're taking something away, and that's going to increase their willingness to be on task more in the future. In that bottom left-hand corner, you see a few different types of visual timers, and there are so many different visual timers. But a lot of people now use just visual timers from like YouTube and stuff like that, where you can find all different kinds of things. So this one is a dog barking alarm sound, whenever time's up, but there are all different kinds of those that you can find on YouTube for different amounts of time and everything else. There are also several websites that do digital timers that you can use and pull up, on the screen so students can see how much time they have left. That's something I use in my courses now. And it seems to be very, very helpful to students so that they're able to know what they need to do and how they can stay on task, and how much longer they have to do whatever it is I'm asking them to do. You see those other two visual timers down there? Those are kind of more traditional things. So we have the clock timer that you just turn to whatever amount of time you have, and then the green goes away as that time is going away. And then some little hourglasses down there at the bottom. And those are very cool because you can get them for different amounts of time. So each of these is a different amount of time, but students can see that sand going through and know about how much time they have left. So that one's a little bit different, but it's kind of a fun addition to your classroom. The first then boards are up there at the top on the right hand side. So for our students who are in middle and high school, a lot of times we want to use something that's more like written, instead of pictures. The one on the far right is a traditional first then board with pictures. But for our older students, and our students who maybe are better readers, we can provide those first then boards that are written so that students just know, hey, this is what you're doing now, then this is what you're going to do next. You can do that for individual students, or you can do it for the whole class. That's something I might write on the board. Hey, we're doing this now, and then after that, we're going to do this. Um, Choice boards, which I mentioned, are really, really great no matter what the behavior is or what the function is. But those are just some examples of that. So just allowing students some different ways to show what they know. You can make one of those yourself, or there are tons of online options for different content areas and different tasks and things like that that you can print off, and use for students. So just kind of gives you a great opportunity to let students have a little autonomy and really kind of see where they flourish and what they can do best at. So this next piece is attention. So we've talked about escape, but now attention is another function of behavior. So behaviors that allow the individual to receive some type of attention from someone in their environment. So um, there are different types of attention. So we can get attention from peers. We can get attention from other adults. We can also get positive attention from people, and then we can get negative attention from people. So if we have a student in our class, sometimes they are going to just want positive attention. So you may have that student in your class that always wants validation from you about their answers or their work or something like that. So that's probably due to some kind of attention piece. Then we also have students who want attention from their peers. So maybe they tell a joke in the middle of class. Um, Again, just like escape, all of that has been reinforced at some point in time. So that is why students continue to do that. So in our example down here, a student tells a joke in the middle of class, their classmates laugh, the student continues the joke telling pattern during class. So because their classmates laughed, they got that attention from their classmates. And so they continue to do that because in the past, their classmates laughed. So they want those classmates to laugh at them. Attention is another big area that we see for our students, especially in middle and high school, where sometimes they're trying to figure out who they are and who their friends are and all of that stuff. Um, but then you may also see students trying to get some kind of attention. They don't care if it's negative or positive. So they may do something in class that you reprimand them for, and then they continue to do that because you're giving them attention. Even though to us, it's like, why would they want that negative attention? It doesn't matter sometimes because they're just wanting attention so bad that it's okay that it's a reprimand. It doesn't have to be some kind of praise. So attention is one of those things that is kind of hard to think through sometimes, but it is one that we do see often in our classrooms. So, some different strategies we can use whenever we're thinking about attention is providing frequent praise. So, we're frequently praising students for doing what they're supposed to be doing. So, we're giving them that attention without them requesting it. That's just good policy generically, just good teaching, but we're giving them that without them trying to do something to earn it. Um, Doing frequent check-ins. So if you know you have students who need that attention, who want that attention, who are going to do something to get that attention, doing frequent check-ins with them is really, really important. So that's a way you can kind of eliminate some of those behaviors that maybe are not as beneficial to the classroom and maybe disrupt the classroom along the way if you're just checking in with them. So they're getting that attention from you, but they're not doing some kind of behavior in order to get that attention. Reinforcing appropriate behaviors. So, just reinforcing, like we've already talked about, providing them something that's going to increase that behavior, taking something away that they don't like that's going to increase that behavior. Planned ignoring, that is something that in the ABA world that we talk a lot about. We're talking about. students' behaviors and things like that. We do planned ignoring sometimes for attention. That's very difficult in a classroom. But basically, you are just totally ignoring that student and whatever behaviors that they're engaging in. So you're not giving them any kind of attention. You're not looking at them. Their peers are not looking at them. No one is giving them any kind of attention. That's not always the best option for students, but sometimes it's the only option that we have to try. So that's not something I would just recommend just doing one day, but it is something I wanted to mention because if you do have a student in your class who is receiving applied behavioral analysis services, that might be something that the therapist recommends. And then teaching and modeling appropriate social skills. So just again, making sure students know when it's appropriate, how it's appropriate to ask for attention or gain attention. That's something that we can teach our students. And it's something that sometimes they just don't know. Sometimes we think that, oh, well, they should know that it's not appropriate to yell in class, or they should know that it's not appropriate to be talking to their friends here in class. But sometimes they don't know those things, and we have to model those and teach those things along the way, especially for our students in middle school. They're just kind of learning about themselves and getting to know their social groups and friend groups. So that's an area that we really need to work on and appropriately model those skills. So just again, that little positive and negative reinforcement visual there for you here. And then if you do planned ignoring, again, like I said, I would not recommend just jumping in and doing it. Sometimes you'll have signs up so that like if somebody comes into the classroom, they're not going to engage with that student. They're going to understand why you're ignoring that behavior. So you don't want to just do it and then not tell anybody why you're doing it. So then that next one is tangible. So tangible is like something we want. So we want a tangible item. But this is because an individual engages in a behavior in order to get access to that preferred item or activity. So again, this is something we see quite a bit. So you can think about this example. A child cries and her mother gives her a toy. In the future, the child will cry again to gain access to a toy. So you see a pattern here with all of these that these behaviors have been reinforced at some point in time. So because the child cried, their parent gave them a toy, they are going to cry again in the future to get another toy. That's just how behavior works. Behavior happens because of the way that we reinforce it, and the things that people gain from it. So if you have a student in class who they every time that you say, "Hey, I need you to get out your textbook and read chapter three," every time they do that, if they don't want to do that, and in the past because they've said, "Hey, I'm not going to do that," or they've just not done it. You've given them the worksheet without them reading whatever it is you need them to read. They're probably going to do that. Not that the worksheet is a preferred item, maybe, but it's preferred over them reading the textbook. So they're accessing something that they want instead of whatever it is that they have at that moment in time. So giving them access to tangibles, that is one that we see often because we're kind of just trying to get through whatever it is that's going on. So we see that a lot with younger children, but we also see it with older children. So some strategies we can use a reward system or a token board, and I'm going to explain that more in just a minute. Using visual schedules so students know what's next, what they're supposed to be doing, how much time they have to do this. That can help with that because they know that they're not going to be in this situation they're in forever. So that's not going to be an all day situation. Things are going to change and they're going to rotate through classes. And then visual timers, again, we talked about those already. And then rewarding them with a preferred item or activity. So if they know that, okay, well, I'm not going to be able to get access to the iPad if I, you know, don't do my work, but I know if I do my work, I can get access to the iPad. So making that contingent on them actually doing that work and putting that work in, that helps with this tangible function of behavior. So up in that left-hand corner, we see kind of a schedule for what the day looks like. I love like a class-wide schedule, so it's also helpful in that right-hand corner. You can do individual schedules for individual students, but that's hard for them to keep up with sometimes. So I like just kind of an overview of what the class is so that students know what they're doing, what they're expected to do, and kind of the timeline on some of that stuff. So that is just good for every student, whether or not they have any kind of behaviors or not, for them to know what's coming up. We see more visual timers down here, like we'd already talked about. And then the remainder of these pictures on here are like token systems or reward systems for you to use. So I've seen people in the past give tickets out individually to students, and then after a certain amount of times, those students can turn their tickets in for like a homework pass or a snack or something like that. That's an effective way to use token systems in a middle and high school setting. But there are a few different ideas on here too. So, the top one up there that says we can raise our hands before speaking, that is like a class-wide one. So students or the class could earn letters throughout the class. Um, of that day. And then, once they earn whatever the word is, then maybe they get some kind of reward. So that could be a 10-minute break. That could be a 5-minute break. It could be that you have class outside. It doesn't have to be anything big. But you know what your students' needs are and you know what their wants are, and you would know what would be something that would be motivating for them. That's another piece with all of this, with the reinforcement and stuff. You need to know what motivates your students. So, are they going to be motivated by a 10-minute break? Are they going to be motivated by snacks? What's really going to get them to want to do whatever it is you're asking them to do? Right underneath that word one, you have the banking your points. Again, that's similar to like the tickets that I talked about. So those are individualized for each student. So maybe throughout the day, when they're in your class, they get like a ticket for answering a question correctly, or they get a ticket for working quietly, or they get a ticket for, something. You can decide what the parameters are for that based on whatever your content is, and whatever your students' needs are. But they could put those tickets in their little pockets here, or they could keep up with them themselves, and then turn those in at some point for whatever kind of reward it is that they want. It's also very important whenever you set up these token systems that you set up the awards at the beginning, so that students know what it is they're working for. Because if they don't know what they're working for, they're probably not going to work as hard. This one at the bottom, the ice cream movie day extra recess, it is a class-wide one as well. So each day, maybe the students do X, Y, and Z. So then you give them however many beans or marbles or whatever you want to put in the jar. And then eventually they can work for those different things. So again, it's very important that you set forth and say, these are the rewards you can work for. And you could ask students what they want to work for. So in my classroom, I asked students, hey, what would be something that would be rewarding for you? And sometimes it was simple as like deciding what kind of genre of music we were going to listen to that day. So it's not always hard. It's not always expensive. A lot of times it's the simple things that they really, really enjoy. And then down there at the bottom in the right-hand corner, this is something that I think is an interesting idea. So if you I see a student doing something good, you could pull out a reward stick. So there are rewards written on the sticks, and they get whatever that is on there. That is one way that you can do something like that. Or you can do just like the bean jar, and once they collect a certain amount of popsicle sticks, then that means they get a prize. So I think it's kind of fun to do it where you draw it out, and whatever is on the stick is what their reward is. If they are doing something good that day. That just makes it a little bit more kind of gamey, like gamifies things a little bit more, and students do like that, um, especially our middle and high school students. But again, all of these are just suggestions. You know what will work best in your classroom. And it probably will surprise you that some of this stuff will work, because a lot of times you think, I don't know if that's actually going to be beneficial or not. But it will be, because students, no matter how old they are, they enjoy some of those different behavior things, and getting rewards and feeling like they're getting to do something kind of special. That always helps with their behaviors. So this final category is sensory or automatic. This is one that we don't see quite as often, whenever we're talking about these functions of behavior. But so we're looking to see if they are engaging in some kind of behavior in order to have some type of internal sensation. Um, this doesn't rely on other people, so this is something they can do themselves. So this might be students clicking a pen. This might be students tapping their feet. It might be anything like that, that is getting some kind of sensory input for them. So it might be getting up and walking around the classroom. So they're not trying to escape whatever it is you're asking them to do, but they're just needing that kind of sensory input, or something that they can give themselves. So some strategies for this would be like sensory breaks. That would be kind of taking a moment to figure out some different things you could do. So maybe that's playing with fidget, maybe that's playing with some putty, maybe that's taking a walk. There are lots of different things you can do for sensory breaks. Fidgets, I know that's a thing that sometimes people don't like because students are loud with them. But again, if you can teach appropriate ways to use fidgets in your classroom, it's something that I allow my students to use. If it helps them stay on task, then it's like I'm more than happy for them to have those. You could provide a box for them, or you could just say, you can have your own, um, whatever works best for your students. But for those students who need that sensory input to be able to pay attention, it's a great option. Flexible seating, so having, some different seating options for students, that is a great way to make students feel less like they're just sitting in a classroom all day. And really, for our middle and high school students, sometimes those desks are not the most comfortable. So giving them some different options where they feel like they have some autonomy and can make choices about where they sit, that's a great way to help with that. Just thinking about the environment and meeting sensory needs. So if you do have students in your classroom who have specific sensory needs, maybe they're really sensitive to sound or light or smells or different things like that. But just thinking about how you make your classroom environment for those students, that's really, really important and a really great proactive way to eliminate some of those potential behaviors you may see because they are needing or being overloaded in that sensory input. So here's just some visuals to show you some different things like that. So in that left-hand corner at the top, we have some different sensory break ideas. So obviously, not all of those would be things that middle or high schoolers would be interested in, but it is stuff that, we can kind of think about. Again, you think, oh, well, middle or high schoolers don't want to blow bubbles. It would surprise you. They enjoy stuff like that. So just giving them opportunities to do some stuff that maybe we typically wouldn't think that they would enjoy. Again, it's another great way that you can talk to students and say, hey, if we had like where you could request a sensory break, what would it be that you would like to do? Would you like to have kinetic sand? Would you like to have some kind of slime? What would be something that would be good for you and help you kind of chill out? And talking about kind of chilling out and stuff like that. In that bottom left-hand corner, we have a calming corner, which is something that I would recommend having in your classroom if you have space. I know we don't always have space for things like that, but just having an area for students to be able to go and kind of decompress, because sometimes our students get really overstimulated, overwhelmed, and they just need somewhere where they can just take 5 minutes and kind of calm down. That's another great opportunity for something like that. So some schools have like rooms that are not in the specific classrooms for students to be able to go. A lot of times they're like in the counseling area and stuff like that. But that's a great thing for students to be able to use. Again, you don't want students to be going in there every day. You have to teach them how to use them appropriately and request for them appropriately. But that's a very big part of what we have to do to teach them how to take care of those spaces and not abuse the opportunity to go in there. At that bottom picture, you can see some flexible seating options. You can see the low lighting with the scarves over the lights, just a good kind of chill classroom environment. That's very important. Again, that's something students can be involved in and they can tell you kind of something that's good for them or not. In that top right-hand corner, some more flexible seating options. Obviously, in the bottom right-hand corner, we have some different fidgets. Those are not all the fidgets that exist. There are so many fidgets now, but just some different options like that. And then for the student in the desk, you probably have seen this or have heard about this at some point in time, but a lot of people will put like exercise bands around the legs of a desk. So instead of a student tapping their feet or something like that, or feeling like they need to get up, they can put their feet on that band and move them. It's quiet and it also meets some of those sensory needs. So all of this is to say that like you just need to think about your students' needs and what is causing some of those behaviors you may be seeing. And going ahead and designing these spaces and giving these opportunities can help you to not have as many behavioral issues in your class because you're being proactive in your planning. So, we've already talked a little bit about positive and negative reinforcement, but I also just want to mention positive and negative punishment. We try to not use punishment unless we just absolutely have to. But it's just important for you to understand the differences in all of these things. So, positive reinforcement, like I said, is something is added to increase the likelihood of a behavior. Negative reinforcement is that something is removed to increase the likelihood of behavior. With positive punishment, something is added to decrease the likelihood of behavior. So that would be like reprimands and stuff like that. Um, that, like I said, we don't want to use punishment unless reinforcement does not work. Because reinforcement is going to be our first go-to because it is a more positive experience for the students. Then we have negative punishment when something is removed and it decreases the likelihood of behavior. So, um, maybe we have students who they typically do group work, something happens, and we say, okay, well, no group work for the next week. So we are removing that opportunity for group work, and that should decrease the likelihood of behavior. Again, we don't always like those punitive measures, but sometimes those are necessary if reinforcement has not worked. But I cannot say enough, try reinforcement first to see if that's going to work. Whether it's positive reinforcement or negative reinforcement, that should be your first go-to. So, measuring behavior is also something that is kind of part of this whole conversation of understanding behaviors and classroom management and all of that. But understanding how we can measure behaviors in our classroom is really important. So, there is actual research that shows that teachers will say, well, so and so is really, he is just misbehaving in my class all the time. And it's like, okay, well, how often it is happening? Is this happening 90% of the time, 75% of the time, 50% of the time? Oh, it's happening 90% of the time. And then if somebody actually goes in and collects data on it, it's probably not happening even 50% of the time. But behaviors feel really magnified whenever we are up there teaching and we're trying to get to some kind of goal. We're trying to lead all of these students to some kind of learning goal. Um, so it feels magnified whenever we're up there. We don't do that on purpose. It's a subconscious thing, but it is very important to understand how much a behavior is actually happening so that we know how to address it. So there are several different ways you can collect data, and I know there are a million different things you're already doing as a teacher. So collecting data seems like an additional thing that you don't have time to do. But some of these are easier and don't take as much bandwidth for you to be able to do. And if you could have somebody else come in your classroom and do some of these things, that's also helpful, so that you kind of have like a traditional classroom setting going on with somebody else in there collecting data. So, again, not saying you have to do any of these, but these are just things that if you are really struggling with behaviors in your classroom, these are some things you could do to kind of help support that. So frequency is just counting how often a behavior occurs. So maybe you're doing like tally marks. Okay, if that student is talking out without raising their hand. I'm going to put a tally mark. Oh, they're doing it again. They're doing it again. And you're probably going to just be collecting this on one student at a time. I would not recommend just collecting it on the whole class. There are a couple of these that you could do whole class, but like for frequency, you're probably just going to be focusing on whatever behavior is that one student is doing that you have identified as the biggest issue going on in your classroom at that point in time. Duration is just measuring how long the behavior lasts. Okay, so I have a student who is getting up out of their seat and they're not doing their work. So I'm going to time how long they're up out of their seat, not doing their work. Latency is the time between me giving instruction and the behavior. So I say, okay, get out your textbook. And I know this student is going to take a while to get their textbook out. So then maybe I start a timer and then I stop my timer whenever the student finally gets their textbook out. So you're just measuring how long it takes for them to actually engage in whatever it is that you're asking them to do. Then we have interval recording, which is sampling behavior in time chunks. So like we have a behavior that happened at any time during the interval. So partial interval is going to be, we have a 30-second interval. Oh, the behavior occurred. Okay, so the behavior occurred. So that means for that whole interval, we count that as time that the behavior occurred. Then we have whole interval, which is another type of interval recording, but that means the behavior has to occur the entire interval. So we have students who, okay, so it started, oh, we're taking 30 minutes or 30 seconds, and it has happened the whole interval. So then I can count it. If it does not happen that whole 30-second interval, then you do not count it. Partial and whole interval take a little bit more time. So I would recommend doing something more like frequency or duration, depending upon the behavior and what the needs of your classroom are. But those are a little bit more of a heavy lift for you to be doing as a classroom teacher. Then we have momentary time sampling. So looking up periodically and just noting if a behavior is happening or not. That's something that teachers use very frequently. So we know that, okay, we have a student who is off task. So every 5 minutes, I'm going to look up and see if they're actually doing their work or not. And if they're not doing their work, I'm going to write down that they've not done their work. Okay, I'll look up 5 more minutes. Oh, they're still not doing their work. I'll look up in 5 more minutes. Oh, they're doing their work now. So I'm not going to write a tally mark down. So that's just kind of a moment in time you're looking to see if they're doing their work. We also have ABC recording, which is something that we definitely see used in the classroom a lot, and it helps us figure out the functions of behaviors. That's really, if you're struggling to figure out why behavior is occurring in your classroom, it's a great way to do that. So you're looking at the antecedent, so what's happening right before this target behavior, then you see the behavior itself, and then you're seeing the consequence. So what's happening right after that target behavior is happening. So if I have a student who is requesting to go to the bathroom, I'm thinking, okay, well, there's some reason they're doing that every single day. What's going on? So the antecedent is, okay, well, I'm assigning work. As soon as I assign work, that student has to go to the restroom. And then the consequence has always been, okay, yeah, you can go. And then they're gone. So, and they're not doing their work. So I can see that the function of that behavior is them escaping whatever that task is that I'm giving them. Permanent product is just measuring the outcomes of a behavior. So, like graded assignments are a permanent product, exit tickets are a permanent product. We actually have some kind of physical outcome based on whatever that behavior was. And then you can do teacher-made rating scales and rubrics. So, things that you have made or things that you have adapted over time to kind of check in with students to see what is going on. So, if one of these others don't fit that, you can just make up some kind of rubric or rating scale that can help you know how to best serve your students or what those behaviors are. So we've talked a ton about behavior, and I know you're probably like, when are we going to get to the actual classroom management stuff? But all of that behavior stuff is really important for you to understand, because if we don't understand the root cause of a lot of our classroom management struggles, which is behavior, those behaviors we're seeing, and those root causes of those behaviors, then what we do in our classrooms doesn't really matter. So it helps for us to understand behavior to be able to be proactive instead of just reactive, and providing punitive responses for some of those things we're seeing in our classrooms. So, whenever we think about designing our classrooms, we want to think about it through that lens of classroom management. So, what we do in our classrooms, whenever we're thinking about classroom management, the real definition of that should be is what we do to organize students, space, time, and materials so that unhindered learning takes place. So, um, we do this in a way that, we can make sure our classrooms are successful places for our students to be. So we want to design our classrooms in a way that is meaningful to students, is a way that students can grow and learn. And again, that's all part of that proactive piece. So if we're designing environments that are conducive to student learning and belonging, then we're going to have a lot less behavioral issues later on. Um, Classroom management, a lot of people think classroom management is discipline. It is not. It is how we set up our classrooms, how we design our spaces and our lessons for the learners that we have and their unique needs. So, an effective teacher, to be effective, that means that you need to have positive expectations for your student success. So that is positive expectations and high expectations for all learners, no matter what those students' current needs are or what their current abilities are. We should have high expectations for all of our students. If students do not feel like there are high expectations for them, both behaviorally and academically and socially, then they're probably not going to try to meet those things. We have to make sure that those expectations are known to the students. So we have to teach students what our expectations are for them, and what we need them to do. So an effective teacher is also very good at knowing what is going on in their classroom. So that goes back to that relationships piece. You're building relationships with students, you're gathering information, you know what's going on. Um, you're figuring out how to best serve the students in your classroom. So, when we think about knowing what's going on in our classroom, we have to make sure that we are involved with our students. We're building those relationships and we're understanding what they may not understand. So, a lot of times we'll see behaviors and classroom management issues whenever students don't understand the content or they don't like the content. So, we have to understand those things and work through those things. So, those can be situations where you talk to students about, hey, what's going on? Those can also be situations where you talk to students about, like, hey, I know you feel like you're really struggling in this class. What can I do to better support you? Again, because we're dealing with older students, it's a really great opportunity to have those conversations, because they are becoming self-directed learners and they know what they're good at and what they're not good at. And we need to help them kind of figure some of that stuff out and talk through some of that stuff because we want them to be able to, have some kind of advocacy for themselves and understand who they are as learners and be able to think about their cognition. And then knows how to design lessons to meet students' needs for mastery. So again, going back to that, we understand our students, we understand their needs, we understand how they learn best. That all falls into that same classroom management piece because if students feel like they are not involved, if they feel like the lesson is not involving them, if it's not engaging, then they're really going to struggle to stay on task. And that's where a lot of those behaviors come from that we see. So we just need to make sure that we are helping students be successful and meeting whatever those content mastery standards are. So, well-managed classrooms, obviously, this is again very proactive. There's a plan before class. So we're not rolling into class every day and just being like, oh, okay, well, this is what I think we're going to do today. You already know before the day what you're doing. You have a good plan. Maybe you don't have a totally written out lesson plan, but you do know what you're doing that day. You've already made your copies. You're ready to go. Students are engaged in the lesson because you have it planned out well. Now, not every single day are things going to go exactly like you want them to, but that should not be the norm. So, making sure that you are on topic, on task, and students are engaged in the lesson is all part of that well-managed classroom. Because if students are engaged in the lesson and learning, then there's going to be less time for them to have behavioral outbursts or do something that is going to throw off the whole course of the day. Students know the expectations of the classroom. So I've included here the 3 to 5 rule. That just means that you need to have 3 to 5 classroom rules or expectations. So I'm sure at some point in time we have all seen people with like 20 rules in their classrooms. First off, that's ineffective because, you know, students cannot remember all those rules. They are constantly probably worried about breaking any of those rules. And really, most of those rules are probably repetitive. But if we have 3 to 5 set expectations for students, then that's easy for us to remind them. They're able to remember those things and they are able to really know what that looks like. So, um, when we teach students the expectations at the beginning of the year, this is another opportunity for you to be able to involve students in this. You can ask them what they think the expectations are, and you all can have a really good conversation about that if you just take some time to do that. Expectations also should be taught often. So it's not something we teach on the first day of class and then move on with. So maybe we don't explicitly teach them all the time, but we just have reminders where we can tell people, hey, don't forget, these are what the expectations are. Maybe you have them posted in a visual in the classroom. Maybe you tell them different expectations for different things that are going on. Hey, we're going to an assembly today. Let's remember what those expectations are. And that's another thing. Not only will you have expectations for your classroom, but you may have expectations for how students act in the hallway, in the bathroom, at lunch, in an assembly, different things like that. So just having different expectations for different situations and settings is also very, very important. Having very little wasted time or confusion. So working on those transitions and transitions can be so, so difficult. So I completely understand that that's an area that probably all of us can grow in, but just understanding how to make those transitions less awkward and not wasting time because, that's also a time if students are not doing anything or if they're confused about what's going on, then you may see some increases in negative behaviors. And then the atmosphere is structured but welcoming. So again, if you are very planned, if you have engaged students, if you've told them the expectations, if they know what you're expecting, then you're going to have a structured environment. But structure does not mean it's not welcoming. So at the end of the day, being a welcoming environment is so, so important. I cannot stress that enough, that students feel, seen, heard, and valued in your class, that they feel like they can be themselves, and they can make mistakes and they can learn and they can, grow into whoever it is that they're going to be. That's a very important part of it as well. But also having that structure in the background is also very important. So, preparation, I've already talked a little bit about this, just making sure you have everything ready for the day, but being prepared is very, very important. So, you don't want to just kind of be flying by the seat of your pants all the time, trying to figure out what to do. So, having that work-oriented environment that students know what the expectations are, explaining organization and procedures to students. So they know exactly what they're supposed to do. They know exactly what they're supposed to do with the paper. Are they supposed to keep it in their folder? Are they supposed to turn it in? They know exactly where they go if they need a pencil for the day. They know exactly where they turn their homework in at. All of that stuff is very important to have different procedures that you outline to students, again, at the beginning of the year, but then also reminding those things along the way through visuals in your classroom and also verbal reminders. So that first week is really crucial for classroom management conversations and expectations. But that's not something that you do the first week and then never talk about it again. So getting students involved, having them being a part of that process helps a lot. But also practicing those things along the way as you go out throughout the year is really important as well. So preparing the space, thinking about the physical structure of the room, this is something that we overlook a lot of times when we think of classroom management or just building our classrooms and designing our classrooms. But we have to think about the physical structure of our room. So, is it accessible? Is it really cluttered? Is it, overstimulating? All of those things really kind of fall into that category. So a lot of times I talk to other teachers about, make sure that your room represents your students. So I think it's great whenever people have these really cute rooms that they do all this work to and everything else. But your students should be able to see themselves in that room. So make it part of them. A lot of times also in high school, especially, we have a lot of kids in a room. So just making sure that even if it is challenging to figure out how to make that room not feel so jumbled up and cluttered, um, that's really important so that students don't feel like they're just in a tight space all the time. So, thinking about the physical structure, just think about like a room you would like to learn in, and that can kind of help you guide some of that thinking, so that you think about the space, having student space. Students being able to kind of have their own areas. So they have their desks, obviously, but try to not have the desks crammed on top of each other so that they have their own space, because they're getting to be adults, so they need that space for themselves. Knowing the procedures for emergencies, that's just very good practice in general for you to know. But you will be the source of calm if something happens, and you need to guide your students into what to do. So you need to make sure you're familiar with those things. Being adaptable, meet the needs of your learners. So understanding the space, understanding accessibility needs that your students may have. So maybe you have a student who uses a wheelchair. Maybe you have a student who, is going to have to come into class late or leave class early. Just thinking about how all of those things fit. This is also where some of those sensory needs come into play. So if you know you have a student who is really hypersensitive to different smells, maybe, opt for some kind of lighter smell diffuser or something like that, or don't use anything. Really, it's just going to depend on the needs of that student. Provide all needed materials, so be organized. We've already talked about that a little bit. But if you're going to expect students to do something, have all of those materials out and ready, or have them in an area where students know where they're at. So, again, going back to these are the expectations, these are the procedures we have, and having that all outlined. Using visuals and display rules and expectations. So I love the use of visuals in the classroom. There are lots of different ways we can do that. So we've already talked a little bit about visual schedules, some of that first then stuff, choice boards, but also having your rules and expectations displayed is very, very important. Another thing, if you have procedures for different things you're doing, so you're using maybe laptops in class today. So what are the procedures for using that? So first, you want to tell your students what those procedures are, but then also having a visual for that can be really helpful, because sometimes we forget. So it's good to have those visual reminders along the way, where students can kind of see, okay, I've forgotten. I don't want to have to ask. Let me just look to see at the visual what I need to do. And then keeping things posted in a consistent space, not moving your classroom procedures all over the place all the time. They know exactly where to look for that daily schedule. They know exactly where to look for the timer, all of that stuff. Keeping things consistent and organized is very, very important. And then celebrating and reflecting students in your decor. I talked about that a little bit already. Making sure that if you have the opportunity to hang up student work, do that. Or if you have the opportunity to have students do projects, let them lead a lot. Give them those opportunities to lead, in your space, and then also in that decor of your space so that they can see themselves reflected in that, and they feel welcomed and involved as well. So we've talked about preparing the space. We've talked a lot about being organized and all of that stuff. But also you need to be prepared yourself. So not every day is going to be a good day, and that's okay. But we have to try to be ready to go on stage at any time. So we have to be ready early. So we don't always want to be sliding in right before class starts to get stuff done. We need to be prepared. We need to have things together. We need to be adaptable to changes. So if something happens, and, we thought we were going to have all day for our lesson in this content block. And then suddenly there's a fire drill. That's okay. We just need to be able to adapt to that and change and do those different things. Sometimes that's easier said than done. But it is very important for us to not let those frustrations kind of change our demeanor or change the way we're teaching our class. Knowing the seating chart and strategy, so just go ahead and know how you're going to have that structured. So maybe you're not going to have like a seating chart, but have a strategy for the way students are going to sit. So just kind of know what your expectations are and what your limitations are for that. Are you going to use flexible seating? Are you not? How does that look? And just being organized in general, having your stuff organized, having the stuff for students organized so that you know where everything is and students also know where everything is. So it's just important to have a plan, obviously, for the first day, but then all those days after it. You just need to be ready for your students every single day when they come in. And again, like I said, some days are, crazy, things happen. But the more we can be prepared and the more we can be structured, the better off we are going to be and the better off our students are going to be. And our classroom management is going to be a lot better. Developing a safe space, I've kind of mentioned this throughout as well, but we want our classrooms to be safe, welcoming, organized, and consistent. So we always want our classrooms to be a place that students want to come into. So we never want to be the teacher who students don't want to come to class just because you're in it. So we have to design those in a way that are welcoming to students so that they feel like they are valued for who they are, and we can see them and we, respect them and everything else. So we cannot expect our students to respect us if we do not respect them. So we have to think about the way we talk to students, the way we welcome students, and the overall ambiance of our classroom. So just think about a space that you would feel safe in. That's what I always tell teachers whenever they're talking about how can I make sure my class is welcoming? How can I make sure my class is a safe space? Just think about, you know, one of your favorite places. How does that make you feel? And this is another place that you can get students involved in and ask them, hey, how could this classroom be more welcoming to you? What would you like about that? And how could we do that? So, and that also falls back into that consistency piece and that organized piece because places that are welcoming are places that we're familiar with. So they know what they are doing, they know what's expected of them, and that all kind of goes together. So it's very similar to that safe space is just a welcoming space. We want our classes to be student centered. We want students to have spaces of their own. We want it to be inclusive and then a mistake friendly environment. Um, Obviously, our students are in our classes to learn, but we also don't want them to be afraid to make mistakes because they are learning. So making sure that students feel that it's safe for them to ask questions, it's safe for them to make mistakes, and everything is not punitive. So again, if we set up our classrooms in a way that students feel like they're going to be supported, they're going to be a lot more willing to take chances and take risks and ask questions and learn more freely. So, having a mistake-friendly environment is a huge piece of that as well. And just students should have ownership in our class. So, a different way to kind of look at getting students involved in your class, but think about and ask yourself, how can students see themselves in your classroom and in your class, and where and how can they show who they are? So is that through different projects that they do? Is that through them being involved in making the classroom expectations? Is that involved in having like jobs in your classroom for students to do? That's going to look different based on the age of your students, and it's also going to look different based on your content area and the way your class is set up. But like, we should not be afraid for our students to be involved in the makeup of our classroom. Our classrooms are there for them. They are in there to learn. So we have to make sure we have that welcoming space for them where they can really become who they are, learn, and do what they need to do. And then it's also important for you to have effective communication. So, speaking clearly and effectively to students, that's a huge piece of things. If students don't know what you expect, if you cannot communicate with students, then that's a huge barrier, obviously, in their learning. And then obviously also in making sure that they are staying on task and your classrooms are being managed in the way they're supposed to be managed. Allowing open and honest conversations as appropriate. And I say that as in meaning we have to make sure we're talking to our students. We're building those relationships. They see us as a human. A lot of times, students are afraid of their teachers or they don't really know how to interact with them because they kind of see them as like, okay, they're on this pedestal and I don't understand math and they understand math really well. So I don't know how I can ask questions. What if they think I'm dumb whenever I ask these questions and different stuff like that? But we don't want our students to feel like that. We want to be approachable adults for them for many things, not only academic, because we are there to support them and build those relationships with them as they are in our classrooms. Using volume and nonverbals effectively. So trying to stay gentle and calm in your tone. So even if something happens, you don't want to go straight to yelling or a heightened sense. You have to make sure that you are trying to keep yourself cool. Now, that is not always possible, but we want to try to stay level-headed at all times whenever we are talking to students, even if something is going on that it requires us to go through some kind of behavioral intervention or something like that. We have to make sure that we are staying calm to de-escalate and diffuse situations as necessary. That goes along with staying controlled in your emotions. So, not just getting flustered, staying very calm, staying very collected, and knowing how to respond to students. And then pay attention to your student needs. Students have expectations for us as well. We don't always think about that, but that's another cool conversation you can have at the beginning of the year whenever you ask students, what do we want our classroom expectations to be? But like, what are your expectations for me as your teacher? What are you wanting to learn from this class? That's a good discussion point and a way to get students talking. And it helps you kind of see into the minds of students and what they're wanting out of your course. It's just a different way to kind of reflect on things. So, obviously, a lot of this is just about how we set up our classrooms, how we're proactive in our behavior management, and all of that stuff. So, just thinking about maybe some of the different behaviors you see in your classrooms and some of the different experiences your students have, that's a good starting place whenever you're thinking about classroom management, how to set up your classroom. So, don't forget that, classroom management is not punishment, it's not our reactions. It is about the way we design our spaces so that all of our students can be successful and we can help them be successful and turn into productive adults after they graduate. So, um, classroom management has always had kind of a bad rap because people think about, negative behaviors, punishment, sending kids to the office and stuff like that. And unfortunately, sometimes that is part of it. But just understanding that we can be proactive in what we do and set up our classrooms in a way that's going to be successful for all of our students can go a long way. So I hope you enjoyed this today. Thank you.